Did Kevin Stefanski mishandle a franchise-caliber quarterback and now carry that shadow into Atlanta? Cleveland fans haven't forgotten the rep battles, the silence, the missed opportunity. And now, with the spotlight back on him, one question lingers: was it development or a decision already made behind closed doors? When Kevin Stefanski walked into Cleveland that season, the quarterback room already felt like a pressure cooker. Veterans were fighting to hold their ground. Young talent was pushing for visibility. And somewhere in the middle of that tension stood Shedeur Sanders, talented, confident, and waiting for real opportunity. On paper, it looked like an open competition. In reality, the timeline tells a more complicated story. Early offseason practices set the tone. First-team reps, the lifeblood of quarterback development, were largely funneled toward the projected starter. That's not unusual in the NFL. Coaches often lean on experience early, but what raised eyebrows wasn't that a veteran got priority. It was how consistently the distribution leaned in one direction, even when performances fluctuated. Practice reports repeatedly highlighted who was running with the starters. And more often than not, Sanders' name appeared attached to scout team duties instead. Public messaging followed a similar pattern. Stefanski emphasized long-term development and earning opportunities week to week. Those phrases surfaced frequently in press conferences. When asked directly about the quarterback hierarchy, answers stayed broad. The focus, he explained, was on improving daily and preparing whoever was slated to start. What rarely surfaced in those moments was a direct, enthusiastic endorsement of Sanders' growth trajectory. In the NFL, that absence can feel significant. Training camp intensified scrutiny. Fans attending open practices noticed flashes, tight window throws, calm movement under pressure, command and 2-minute drills. Yet when preseason rotations were mapped out, Sanders' opportunities remained limited. Some fans believe the competition was never truly balanced. Reports suggested the depth chart structure felt stable long before the public narrative described it as fluid. It's important to note, development timelines differ for every quarterback. Not every rookie or young passer is thrown into the fire immediately, but what fueled frustration wasn't patience alone. It was the perception of containment. Limited first-team reps, limited preseason exposure, limited public backing. When those elements stack together, questions start forming. Inside NFL buildings, hierarchy is communicated not just through words but through reps. Who runs with the starters? Who gets situational drills? Who hears their name praised at the podium? By midseason, the pattern appeared consistent. The quarterback room felt stratified. Sanders was present, prepared, but positioned behind a wall that didn't seem to move. And once that pattern settled in, the narrative shifted from competition to control. Sometimes in the NFL, what isn't said carries more weight than what is. And in Cleveland, the silence around Shedeur Sanders began to feel louder than any headline. Press conference after press conference, Kevin Stefanski fielded questions about quarterback development, competition, and weekly preparation. His answers were polished, measured, safe. But when reporters tried to drill down on Sanders specifically, his progress, his standing, his chances, the responses often drifted back to generalities. It wasn't hostile, it wasn't dismissive, it was simply distant. In a league where public backing from a head coach can elevate a young quarterback's confidence and credibility overnight, that distance stood out. Around the NFL, when organizations believe in their developing passers, you hear it clearly. Coaches highlight growth. They point out improvements in footwork. They praise command in the huddle. They reinforce belief. In Cleveland, those moments felt rare when it came to Sanders. Fans noticed. Local media began subtly tracking rep distribution at practice. Analysts started comparing language used for different quarterbacks in the same room. When one player was described as earning it and another as still learning, even without direct criticism, the contrast painted its own picture. Some fans believe the competition never truly felt open, even if it was framed that way publicly. Social media amplified the perception. Clips of Sanders' limited preseason flashes circulated online, often paired with questions about why those moments weren't earning expanded opportunities. Debate shows picked up the topic, not with outrage but with curiosity. Why wasn't there stronger endorsement? Why didn't the messaging match the flashes on tape? And that's where optics become powerful. In the NFL, perception shapes narrative almost as quickly as performance does. A coach doesn't have to criticize a player for doubt to creep in. Sometimes all it takes is hesitation, when direct questions are answered indirectly, when praise feels cautious instead of confident, when a quarterback's name isn't attached to long-term plans in clear language. None of this proves intent. Development strategies vary. Coaching staffs operate with internal evaluations fans never see, but the absence of visible support created space for speculation. It created room for interpretation. and once that narrative began forming, it spread beyond Cleveland. Because silence, especially in a quarterback room, rarely goes unnoticed. And once the optics shift, regaining control of the story becomes much harder. Then came the part nobody could spin: the film. Because narratives can be shaped, press conferences can be managed, depth charts can be explained, but once snaps hit the screen, interpretation becomes harder to control. When Shedeur Sanders did get on the field, even in limited preseason drives and controlled situations, there were flashes that complicated everything. Not perfection, not dominance, but flashes. Tight window throws layered over linebackers. Calm footwork when the pocket collapsed. Quick progression reads instead of panic scrambles. The kind of small details quarterback evaluators obsess over. It wasn't the volume of reps that stood out. It was the efficiency within them. On third downs, he didn't look sped up. In red zone sequences, he didn't force reckless decisions. When protection broke down, he kept his eyes downfield instead of drifting into chaos. Those are traits coaches preach constantly, and here they were visible in real time. That's when the conversation quietly shifted. Because once tape shows capability, the question becomes simple. If he can do this in limited exposure, what happens with real continuity? What happens with first-team chemistry? What happens when timing with starting receivers is built over weeks instead of scattered snaps? Some analysts began pointing out the sample size caveat, and that's fair. Limited reps don't guarantee sustained success, but they do raise evaluation questions. They force front offices and coaching staffs to justify developmental packing. The more the clips circulated, the more the gap between opportunity and output became part of the debate. And here, what made it even more complicated: Sanders didn't look overwhelmed by NFL speed. That's often the first hurdle for young quarterbacks. Windows close faster, pass rushers collapse quicker, coverage disguises get more complex, yet in his brief appearances, the moment didn't appear too big. Again, not flawless, but composed. When a quarterback looks unready, the film usually exposes it immediately. Late throws, missed reads, mechanical breakdowns. The tape didn't scream that here. Instead, it suggested potential being rationed. And in today's NFL ecosystem, clips travel fast. Former players break them down. Social media accounts isolate mechanics. Independent analysts chart decision-making tendencies. Once that cycle begins, the narrative no longer lives solely inside the building. The tape didn't declare a future superstar, but it did something arguably more powerful. It made people question the ceiling being assigned to him. And once that doubt about the evaluation itself enters the conversation, the spotlight gets brighter, not dimmer. That's when a heavyweight voice stepped into the conversation. When Cam Newton speaks about quarterback development, people don't scroll past it. This is a former league MVP, a player who carried a franchise, a quarterback who understands how early handling can shape or stall a career trajectory. And he didn't approach the situation casually. Newton questioned the evaluation process, not angrily, not recklessly, but directly. He pointed out something that many fans had already been whispering. When a young quarterback shows visible flashes, why restrict the runway? Why not expand the reps? Why not publicly reinforce confidence? He framed it as a developmental issue. Quarterback growth, he explained in past discussions about similar situations, isn't just mechanical. It's psychological. It's about belief from leadership. It's about whether a young passer feels fully empowered or cautiously monitored. When that belief is clear, confidence accelerates. When it feels conditional, hesitation can creep in. That perspective hit differently because it came from experience. Newton has lived through the cycle: draft hype, media scrutiny, organizational shifts, changing narratives. He understands how quickly perception can alter opportunity. So when he openly questioned how the situation was handled, it didn't feel like random commentary. It felt intentional. He also touched on a broader conversation, one that has surfaced periodically across the league. Newton suggested that certain quarterback archetypes sometimes face different evaluation standards. He didn't present it as a definitive accusation. He framed it as a pattern worth examining. Some fans agree, others push back, but the fact that the discussion reached that level tells you how loud the Cleveland handling had become. Because once former MVPs are dissecting developmental strategy publicly, the story is no longer local. It becomes league-wide. Atlanta was paying attention too. Ownership groups monitor narratives, front offices track public perception. When a new head coach arrives carrying unresolved debate from his previous stop, that history doesn't vanish at the state line. Newton's comments didn't attack character, they questioned consistency. If a quarterback demonstrates readiness in limited exposure, what's the threshold for expanded trust? If he earns praise in film breakdowns, why not reflect that same energy internally? If performance under pressure looks composed, what more is required? Those questions don't accuse, they challenge. And challenges in the NFL carry weight. Because quarterback development isn't just about playbooks and practice schedules, it's about signal. It's about who the organization chooses to elevate and when. Whether one agrees with Newton's viewpoint or not, his involvement amplified the scrutiny. It moved the discussion beyond fan frustration and into professional debate. It forced people to re-examine timelines, to revisit tape, to reconsider messaging. And once that happens, the spotlight doesn't dim. It intensifies. Now the setting changes. New city, new building, new logo behind the podium. But history doesn't reset just because the zip code does. When Kevin Stefanski steps into the facility of the Atlanta Falcons, he isn't walking into a rebuild from scratch. He's inheriting a young, explosive offensive core that many around the league believe is already positioned for a leap. At quarterback, there's Michael Penix Jr., a talented passer with his own development timeline and expectations. On the outside, Drake London gives the offense size and reliability. Kyle Pitts remains one of the most intriguing matchup weapons in football, and in the backfield, Bijan Robinson brings elite explosiveness. This is not a bare cupboard. It's a roster that demands careful quarterback stewardship. And that's where the inheritance becomes complicated. Atlanta fans aren't just looking for wins, they're looking for clarity. They want to know how their head coach handles young offensive talent. They want transparency in quarterback development. They want to see growth backed by visible commitment. Because if there's one thing modern NFL fan bases understand, it's this: quarterback handling defines franchises. The scrutiny isn't loud yet, but it's present. Every training camp rep distribution will be noted. Every preseason rotation will be analyzed. Every press conference answer about competition will be compared to action on the field. Falcons supporters have watched what unfolded in Cleveland. Analysts have replayed the timeline. The league conversation already exists. That doesn't mean Stefanski walks into Atlanta guilty of anything. But it does mean he walks in under a microscope. Ownership groups invest heavily in quarterback stability. Front offices build multi-year plans around development arcs. If there's even a perception that a young passer might not receive full backing, questions surface quickly. And perception in today's NFL spreads fast. The Falcons' locker room is also uniquely sensitive to momentum. This is a young offensive unit built on timing, chemistry, and confidence. Quarterbacks need rhythm, receivers need trust, skill players need to believe the system fully supports them. If there's hesitation at the top, players feel it. Some fans believe Atlanta represents Stefanski's opportunity to reset the narrative entirely. A clean slate. A chance to demonstrate transparent commitment to whoever leads the offense. Others argue that patterns tend to repeat unless actively corrected. That debate will unfold in real time. Because here's the reality: Atlanta doesn't need a cautious developmental experiment. They need decisive leadership. They need clear hierarchy when necessary and genuine competition when promised. They need communication that matches action. And most importantly, they need alignment. If the quarterback thrives under Stefanski in Atlanta, the Cleveland chapter fades into background noise. Success has a way of rewriting perception. But if similar questions about rep distribution, messaging, or endorsement begin to surface again, the spotlight won't just return. It will double. This is Cleveland too. It's a proving ground. Here, where this becomes less about one quarterback and more about power. In the NFL, the head coach controls oxygen. He controls reps. He controls messaging. He controls the narrative inside the building long before the public ever hears it. And when it comes to quarterbacks, that control becomes even more amplified. Because quarterbacks don't just compete for snaps. They compete for belief. There's a major difference between saying a competition is open and showing that it's open. Around the league, when a coaching staff truly commits to developing a young passer, the signs are obvious. First-team reps aren't occasional, they're structured. Play calling in preseason isn't conservative, it's exploratory. Press conferences don't sound guarded, they sound invested. Commitment has fingerprints. Control does too. When reps are tightly rationed, when opportunities come only in low-risk situations, when praise is carefully measured instead of confidently delivered, that signals something different, not necessarily sabotage, not necessarily bias, but hesitation. And hesitation at the quarterback position is loud. Because the NFL moves fast, young quarterbacks don't just need coaching, they need runway, timing with starting receivers, chemistry in the huddle, trust in protection calls. That doesn't develop on the scout team, it develops in live-fire reps with the starters. That's why the phrase equal competition carries so much weight. Equal doesn't mean identical. Veterans often get initial preference. That's normal. But equal competition means pathways exist. It means when performance flashes appear, opportunity expands accordingly. It means the leash isn't dramatically shorter for one player than another. Some critics argue that in Cleveland, the language of competition didn't fully match the structure of it. That's their interpretation. They point to rep distribution, they point to public messaging, they point to how long it took for opportunities to scale. And here, where timing complicates everything. When explanations come during the struggle, they feel strategic. When explanations come after the player starts trending upward elsewhere, they feel reactive. That doesn't automatically make them dishonest, but optics matter. In leadership, timing is currency. If a coach emphasizes development plans only after a quarterback begins flourishing under different circumstances, the narrative shifts from foresight to revision. That's the perception challenge. And perception, fair or not, shapes legacy. There's also a subtle psychological layer here. Quarterbacks are wired differently. They carry ego, yes, but also vulnerability. The position demands both confidence and accountability. When a coaching staff fully backs a young quarterback, it creates internal security. Mistakes become teaching moments, not threats to status. When backing feels conditional, every throw can feel like a test. That tension changes development speed. The power dynamic between head coach and quarterback is delicate. Too much control and creativity tightens, too little structure and chaos creeps in. The balance is intentional empowerment. Which raises the real question moving forward. What does empowerment look like under Stefanski now? If Atlanta's quarterback room sees expanded reps for young talent, aggressive preseason experimentation, and consistent public endorsement, the narrative resets. That's how reputations evolve, through visible adjustment. But if similar patterns of cautious distribution, restrained praise, and tightly managed opportunity surface again, critics won't stay quiet. Because once the league starts questioning commitment versus control, every quarterback decision becomes amplified. And in today's NFL, amplified decisions define careers. Now let's talk about the scenario that would change everything. What happens if Shedeur thrives? Not flashes, not a viral preseason moment, not one impressive fourth quarter against backups. What if he actually thrives? Because if Shedeur Sanders steps into a real opportunity, whether in Atlanta or anywhere else, and looks poised, prepared, and franchise-ready, the conversation around Kevin Stefanski doesn't just resurface. It explodes. Quarterback development in the National Football League is the ultimate measuring stick for head coaches. You can scheme creatively, you can manage games efficiently, you can stack double-digit win seasons, but if a young quarterback leaves your system and flourishes elsewhere, the question becomes unavoidable. Did you misevaluate or mismanage? And that's the fork in the road. If Shedeur thrives, it forces a retrospective lens on every decision that led to his limited runway. Rep allocation, messaging, depth chart packing, public endorsement. Every subtle choice becomes evidence in the court of public opinion. Because success elsewhere reframes the past. Let's be clear, player growth is not linear. Sometimes quarterbacks simply mature, sometimes timing aligns, sometimes a different coordinator, a different locker room, or a different city unlocks something that wasn't accessible before. But perception doesn't grade on nuance. If Shedeur becomes composed under pressure, if he commands the huddle with authority, if his anticipation sharpens and his confidence radiates, fans and analysts will rewind tape looking for missed indicators. And here where it gets uncomfortable. The modern NFL doesn't just evaluate coaches by wins, it evaluates them by quarterback trajectory. When a coach is labeled quarterback-friendly, that brand sticks. When doubt creeps in, that sticks too. And narratives travel fast. If Shedeur thrives, it doesn't automatically indict Stefanski, but it does amplify the scrutiny of developmental philosophy. Did caution limit growth? Did veteran preference stall momentum? Was competition truly balanced? Those questions don't disappear once they're introduced, they multiply. Now zoom out. Atlanta is watching closely. The fan base is restless for long-term stability at quarterback. The front office wants conviction, not hesitation. Ownership wants alignment between message and action. If Shedeur thrives elsewhere, that alignment becomes critical. Because the NFL is ruthless with second chances. Coaches get labeled quickly. Quarterback whisperer, defensive mastermind, game manager, too conservative, too rigid, fair or not, labels become shorthand. If Shedeur ascends into a legitimate starter, especially if he shows traits people believed were already there, Stefanski's evaluation process will be dissected nationally. Talk shows will frame it as a development debate. Former players will weigh in. Film analysts will break down early reps versus later tape. And social media. It won't be subtle. But here's the deeper layer most people miss. Thriving quarterbacks shift locker room dynamics. Players notice when talent blossoms elsewhere. They ask questions quietly, they reassess trust, they evaluate whether the system elevates or constrains. That's the real ripple effect. If Shedeur thrives, it doesn't just create a headline, it creates comparison, and comparison fuels accountability. However, and this is important, thriving also creates opportunity. If Stefanski adapts, if he publicly credits growth, if he demonstrates evolved philosophy with his next young quarterback, the narrative can pivot from missed opportunity to lesson learned. The NFL respects adjustment. But stagnation, that's where reputations calcify. So the stakes aren't just about one quarterback's success, they're about legacy, perception, and future opportunity. Because if Shedeur thrives, it becomes more than a player story. It becomes a coaching referendum. And in this league, referendums don't happen quietly. They happen in prime time. In the end, all the debates, all the speculation, all the narratives, they collapse into one unavoidable truth. Performance will decide everything. Not press conferences. Not insider reports. Not fan outrage. Not social media trends. Just performance. Because in the National Football League, time exposes every decision. If Shedeur Sanders becomes a franchise quarterback, calm under pressure, efficient on third down, surgical in 2-minute drills, then history will rewind itself. Every rep he didn't get, every opportunity that felt delayed, every development plan explanation, it will all be re-examined through the lens of hindsight. And hindsight in this league is brutal. But if he struggles, if the flashes remain inconsistent, if the ceiling people projected never fully materializes, then the narrative flips just as fast. Because quarterback evaluation is a high-risk gamble. Coaches make decisions based on practice habits, processing speed, leadership presence, locker room chemistry, and film study discipline. Those variables don't show up in box scores, but they influence depth charts. That's what makes this conversation so complicated. From the outside, fans see talent, arm strength, accuracy, composure, swagger. From inside the building, coaches see installation retention, protection calls, timing precision, response to adversity on Tuesday, not Sunday. Two different vantage points. And sometimes they collide. For Kevin Stefanski, the future isn't defined by what people think happened, it's defined by what happens next. Because the NFL doesn't operate on memory, it operates on results. If Atlanta's quarterback room thrives under his structure, the narrative stabilizes. If young passers develop faster, if aggression replaces hesitation, if clarity replaces ambiguity, then perception adjusts. That's how this league works. But if questions about opportunity distribution and developmental packing resurface, if another young quarterback appears stuck in neutral, if messaging again feels more cautious than committed, then critics won't call it coincidence. They'll call it patterned. And patterns are what shape legacies. There's also a deeper truth here. Quarterback growth isn't just about talent, it's about ecosystem, protection schemes, receiver separation, play calling rhythm, confidence reinforcement, accountability balance. A quarterback doesn't develop in isolation. So when performance finally speaks, it doesn't just judge the player, it judges the system around him. If Shedeur becomes elite, that elevates his resilience and adaptability, but it also invites scrutiny toward any prior system that didn't unlock it. If he becomes average, that validates patience, it reinforces caution, it reframes restraint as wisdom rather than hesitation. Either way, the film won't lie. And that's the part nobody can spin. Not analysts, not coaches, not agents, not fans. When the games matter and the lights are brightest, quarterbacks either command the moment or they don't. Coaches either empower the growth or they don't. Everything else fades. So this isn't really about who won a training camp debate. It isn't about which quote sounded strategic. It isn't even about which fan base felt louder in the moment. It's about trajectory. Two careers now move forward on parallel tracks, one trying to prove he belongs among the league's future, the other trying to reinforce that his developmental philosophy produces winners. And the NFL is watching both. Because this league remembers breakout seasons, it remembers playoff runs, it remembers primetime comebacks. But more than anything, it remembers quarterback decisions. In 5 years, nobody will care about how heated the debate felt today. They'll care about Pro Bowl selections, playoff appearances, contract extensions, Lombardi conversations. That's when verdicts become permanent. Until then, everything is noise. Performance will cut through it. If Shedeur rises, it becomes a redemption arc for him and a pressure test for past evaluations. If he falters, it becomes validation for restraint and a reminder of how difficult quarterback projection truly is. No leaks, no speculation, no narratives, just snaps, just reads, just results. And when the season unfolds, when the throws either hit tight windows or sail high, when the locker room either rallies or fractures, that's when the real answer arrives. Because in the National Football League, truth isn't debated. It's displayed. On the field,